Welcome, everyone. Welcome to everyone that is watching. We're excited. We're going to get started in probably about 1 minute just to give folks a chance to log on and log in. Thank you for being here. Okay. I imagine everyone is on and watching because they are equally as excited as I am to hear from our amazing panelists, which we are going to introduce shortly. So we'll go ahead and get things started. Good evening, everyone. My name is Nestor Ortiz, and I'm with the ACLU of Florida, and I'll be your moderator for the evening. As you can see, we are joined by some amazing panelists, which we will introduce in a minute. But welcome to the ACLU of Florida's We Make the Way segment. Say their names, ending police violence in Florida. Now, before we get started, there are just a couple of housekeeping things we want to go over. Remember, it is technology. If lightning strikes and my camera goes out, then there we are, and the same for all of our other panelists. So please be patient with us. You can ask questions on both Facebook Live and YouTube. Feel free to drop some questions in, and we are going to try to allocate some time at the end for some community questions. So feel free to ask questions. Now, before we get started, I would love to just take a minute to introduce our amazing panel. We're going to just take a minute to hear from our distinguished panel of speakers as they introduce themselves. And we're going to go ahead and start with Ma'Khia Bryant, political consultant with MB Strategies. Ma'Khia.
Thanks, Nestor. It is always such a pleasure to be here with my ACLU fam and, of course, share space with some great thought leaders here like Carl and, of course, Senator Bullard, who has done a lot in this state to make our state better. But I'm a political strategist based out of Tampa, Florida, and am helping to elect progressives up and down the ballot, also to make sure that progressive ideas in terms of ballot amendments and initiatives are getting in the hands of folks who believe in the same thing, and that we're pushing those over the threshold to create a better state for hardworking families in Florida. So, and also do a lot of public affairs work as well in our state to ensure that advocacy doesn't just look like it is only available to special interests, but also that our ideas and ideologies, I can't speak today, are being shared in Tallahassee as they're making the decision-making process there. So certainly glad to be here and have this conversation, particularly around policing with Black people and Black women.
Outstanding. Thank you for that, Ma'Khia. Much appreciated. Next, I'd like to introduce Senator Dwight Bullard, senior political consultant, advisor for Florida Rising. Dwight?
Thank you, and just ditto to everything Ma'Khia said in terms of thanking the ACLU for the invitation. As you pointed out, I'm the senior political advisor for Florida Rising. We are a joint organization that merged as of the beginning of this year. Folks may be more familiar with our legacy organizations, Organized Florida and the New Florida Majority. So we've now become one joint entity called Florida Rising, looking to, be a political home and a social justice home for folks here in the state of Florida that are looking to progress, looking to move things forward, looking to hold elected officials accountable, just generally looking to get involved. But I'd also be remiss if I did not shout out my NAACP peers. I'm the president of the South Dade branch of the NAACP down here in Miami-Dade County. And, we're the oldest, boldest, coldest civil rights organization in the country. And so I just want to shout out all my NAACP folks that may be on the call tonight as well. So happy to be here. Oh, we might Nestor might be a little frozen.
Yeah,
Let's
lightning
get
may
him
have struck.
Am I frozen? Am I frozen?
You were a little bit frozen there, Nestor, but
Oh, sorry about that.
we're working through it. We're working through
I
it.
appreciate that. That's why I noted it in the beginning. I'd like to introduce Carl Takei, Senior Staff Attorney for ACLU's Trone Center for Justice and Equality. Carl?
Yeah, thank you for having me here. Like Nestor said, I am Senior Staff Attorney at the National ACLU, and my role is to coordinate our work on policing across all of these different projects and departments and make sure that we're all sort of driving toward the same goal, which is for the past year, the ACLU has committed itself to divesting from policing and reinvesting in Black and Brown communities. And you know, our policing advocacy and our litigation are all now centered around that primary goal.
Outstanding. Thank you for that, Carl. So now that everybody has met our panelists, we're just going to kind of dig in. Again, our hope is to get through some moderated questions, and then we're going to hopefully open that up to the community towards the end. So stick with us. Again, drop any questions you might have. So now I'm going to ask the first question, and this is just going to be a very general question for our entire panel, and it's a heavy one. What is the problem with policing in America? And anybody can start that off. What is the problem with policing in America? And I see, Dwight, your mic is off, so I feel like I'm gunning for you, buddy.
My mic's going to stay off. I'm just, I'm here for the conversation. But
I hear that.
But I'm gonna go out there and just say it. It's inherently racist in its origin, right? At the end of the day, when we think about policing in America, you know, with all the adoration, and I'll be the first to say I'm a fan of Law and Order SVU. That is my go-to show. But that is also indicative of the larger problem, right? Is that we have these support systems of a system that is inherently racist in its origins. And what I mean that specifically, especially we're talking about the South, is that policing in this country, especially in the South, takes its root in the slave catching and the process of returning, enslaved Africans to servitude. You know, these were the patrols. They patrolled, the fields here in Florida. They patrolled much of the South, and that was the goal. And so when you kind of have that at its core, right, this idea that policing Black bodies is the structure by which we will build this house on, that's going to be the problem. And what you're seeing manifest time and time again is the inability to rectify that origin, right? The idea that, the conceptualization of the policing of Black and brown bodies, regardless of gender, regardless of identity, is the standard bearer by which policing in this country operates. And I know a lot of people get uncomfortable with that idea, but I need people to be comfortable in that uncomfortable nature that they find themselves in, because if you find yourself in a community that is policed versus that of a community that has the freedom to call police without any retribution or without any concerns to safety or life, that shows you the very divide that happens. You know, I can find a 12, 13, 14-year-old in any Black community in this country and ask them, well, what is the day that you see police most prevalent? Or in the case of Miami, what is jump out day, which is the day that police officers will come into a community, kick in doors, harass, etc. And they know that, when I was a teacher, they'd be like Thursday or Tuesday or Wednesday. And so that is the basis of a much larger problem. But I'll stop because I know we have a large conversation to talk about.
Thank you for that, Dwight. And I just want to add, these are not things that we see in historically white communities or well-off communities. These are things that are primarily focused on low-income and communities of color, for sure. Thank you for that. Carl or Ma'Khia? Ma'Khia?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here. I certainly think the level set that the senator provided was absolutely spot on, but I think another kind of notch to that is the lack of accountability, right? So if we are going to continue to use the system of policing as a synonymous with safety or patrol, and we don't necessarily have best practices in place, and especially not laws that afford itself or lend itself to accountability. That is the root of the problem. And unfortunately, because we live in this new digital age, our ability to watch this in live time has certainly exacerbated the problem, right? Like, we are watching in real time folks be over policed in communities across this country and not be held accountable for their actions. And it can, run the gamut, whether it is, just an excessive use of force or an excessive use of deadly force, and all of which still needs to ensure that we have equitable ideas around accountability across the board, whether you live in suburbia or you live in the inner city. And the legislating from that posture should also lend itself to law enforcement, right? Like, we shouldn't hold law enforcement above the veil, excuse me, when we're having this conversation about ensuring accountability. If teachers have to go through the same process of certification, law enforcement officers should. And I think that is the root of our problems here, and particularly the scope of what it means for Black mamas, right? Like, what does it mean to, have your child, whether they be boy or girl, go out into the world and not know if they're going to come back home safely because of, a potential law enforcement action, and having that conversation with your children about how to act around law enforcement. That is inherently wrong. And, law enforcement officers are people. And we all enter this world the same. And, law enforcement is a career path. Like, all of us have chosen a career here on this panel, and for those who are watching. And so we have to get back to the root of accountability from a legislative perspective, and also going back to, if we are, associating that all of us are equal, and going back to the Constitution of, all of us being able to access those same equitable rights, that law enforcement needs to, and the culture of law enforcement needs to, honor that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Ma'Khia. Much appreciated. I mean, and for me, I've been like banging the drum on accountability for a long time, and a lot of people have across the country. And it almost seems like now in this time, police officers are getting less accountability, or less accountable for their actions. So thank you for that, Ma'Khia. Carl.
Yeah, I want to echo Maya's thanks for the senator's level setting about, the origins of police in America, especially in the South, in slave patrols, because, there is this through line about who is policed and who is policed most heavily and who's not. And all that falls down on, race lines that, it is, if you look back through, not just decades, but centuries, it is Black and brown people who are heavily policed, and, in a way that is radically different from the way that wealthier white communities are policed. And the problem is also about what is being policed in the communities that have this kind of heavy police presence. So, there are about 10.3 million arrests that police make every year. Of those, only about 5% are for the sort of headline grabbing crimes, that are sort of considered the most serious, murder, rape, aggravated assault. The other 95% are these quality of life issues, and issues that stem from poverty, from drug and alcohol related issues, from a lack of community mental health care. And so for that 95%, we have massively overinvested in police as the first line response, oftentimes the only response to these issues, and massively underinvested in the kinds of supportive programs and services that would actually help care for people and meet their human needs, and obviate the need for any kind of heavy-handed response when somebody spirals into a mental health crisis, when somebody, because of poverty or because of substance abuse issues, ends up doing something that they later regret.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Carl. That actually brings me to another question that I'd like to just kind of put out there. What Carl noted was the investment we're making financially into law enforcement agencies, and the lack of investment we're making into the communities that are suffering the most under law enforcement agencies. So my question for this panel is, what is police divestment and reinvestment? How much is policing costing Florida or nationally every year? What do those financial things look like?
Yeah. Oh, well, I mean, I'll definitely jump out, and I'm sure Carl and Maya have some more deliberate numbers, but just on average, local governments are spending anywhere between 33% to 50% of their overall budget on law enforcement or so-called public safety. Um, and what does that translate to in the real dollars? I can use Miami as an example. Our county policing budget, like just the policing, we're not even talking about jails, but the policing budget itself is about $800 million. I mean, think about that. We look at like cities like New York, they're spending, billions with a B, billions of dollars on policing. And to the points that Carl made a few seconds ago, policing around what? And so one of the things that agitates me and aggravates me when I think about, these kinds of things that, are embedded in the American psyche about who the boogeyman is, and say we're going to do a war on drugs, right? We're going to, war on terror. We say these things that are just there's no tangible correlation to that. There is a racial correlation to many of those things because going back to the initial banning of marijuana in this country, the application of who were these purveyors of the use of marijuana and the takers of marijuana were oftentimes put on black bodies, black human beings. You have people who refer to, the jazz man, these jazz musicians would always smoke marijuana, or these types of people would smoke marijuana. So the same thing goes with the use of crack cocaine, some powder cocaine, so forth and so on. And we're talking about communities that, statistically speaking, do not have investments in poppy seed fields, do not have, you know, uh, passports or planes in order to bring these things over. So it becomes a question of not only do you have a systemic problem of the notion of policing, but you have an even greater systemic problem about the application of those things that are being policed on particular communities, which means you have multiple systems working to inflict harm on certain people within a larger society, and that in itself is criminal, right? But that is the system that we are working against, is this idea that even though these communities are under resourced, are underrepresented politically, are underrepresented in terms of the makeup of some of the upper management or city executives, etc., they're still having this like gross application of resources on policing versus that which is the thing that's going to help them. So to answer your question, I'm sorry for going on a little soapbox, was we're talking about taking these huge dedicated resources in law enforcement and shifting them to the need. But I want to say this, it has to be an equitable distribution, not an equal, because there's a distinction, equitable distribution of those resources, meaning that if you have caused the community harm and inflicted harm on communities for decades, there is a price to pay to correct and remedy and repair the damage that you've done to those communities. So we're talking about communities that have not had park infrastructure, have not had healthcare infrastructure, have not had mental health infrastructure, have not been given the same, liberties and options to thrive as other communities have. And you look no further than the actual history books. Like the other side of the tracks didn't get the same amount of money as those who were on, the quote unquote right side of the tracks, right? Because even though they were paying taxes, whether it's Plessy versus Ferguson or Brown v. Board, we see this dynamic happening. So that is what we're trying to work towards in terms of an investment, is an equitable reinvestment into communities that have not been resourced properly from the get-go.
Thank you for that, Dwight. If I can, to Carl and or Ma'Khia, what would that redistribution of those dollars look like in a practical sense? What would that look like on the ground, and how do we move forward from that?
Yeah. So, I mean, first, I want to emphasize that this kind of shift of resources is actually something that this country has done before, and it's a story that not a lot of people know. And that is in the creation of EMT staffed ambulance services. For most of the 20th century, if you lived in a city in America and you needed emergency transport to a hospital for a physical medical emergency, depending on where you lived, you had one of two options. One, you could call a funeral home and they would send a hearse and pop a siren on top of the hearse and throw you in the back of the hearse and race you to the hospital without receiving any medical care. Or you could call the police and ask the police to send a squad car and take you to the hospital. And in Pittsburgh, for example, if you lived in a Black neighborhood, the funeral homes refused to service those neighborhoods. And so the only way to get to the hospital was calling the police. An organization called Freedom House started a new project of a system of vans that were staffed by first doctors and nurses, and then they created this category of paramedics to actually provide medical care to folks on the way to the hospital. And it created a lot of positions. These vans were overwhelmingly staffed by Black people from the communities that they were serving. And they supplanted that other model of calling the police entirely. And they also led to the creation of national standards in Congress. So, this started in the late 1960s. By the time you got to the early mid-1970s, Congress had adopted this as a model, had started providing funding, had provided federal standards for EMTs and ambulances based on that Pittsburgh Freedom House model. And so that's the same kind of thing that we can do in these other contexts, like in providing mental health responses when people are experiencing a mental health crisis that are a purely medical mental health response with mental health providers and peer support counselors coming out in a van in the way they do in some cities, like in Eugene, Oregon, to provide compassionate care. It can operate the same way in all of these other settings where police are responding, like in schools, like in other issues involving behavioral health and substance use issues. And we can just start building out all of these responses in all of these different contexts in ways that don't rely on a police response.
Carl, thank you for that. Lots of things to consider. And Ma'Khia, I'm going to throw this to you. There are a lot of people, when they hear about divestment or redistribution of police dollars, they feel like, oh my gosh, cops are going to go away and crime is going to run rampant. And I feel like that might be like a messaging thing. Do you have any thoughts about what that messaging looks like and what was wrong with it?
Absolutely. We were in the midst of an electoral cycle when we saw yet again another murder of a Black man online, right? And immediately, because of this re-triggering that has happened to Black and brown people to watch this over and over again, and policy, suggestion was birthed out of this, right? And the message was to defund the police. And unfortunately, and I know ACLU is a nonpartisan organization, but we have to call a thing, like Republicans took that and used that against us, right? And said that, Democrats, and particularly Black and brown people, don't believe in law enforcement. We don't believe in public safety and law and order. And we wanted to have lawlessness, is what we saw in many mailers and TV ads running across the nation. And it just went to further stipulate how, like, even having a conversation and a discussion about policy and to level set there wasn't open for discussion. So that only iterates that they're digging deeper into this idea of polarization on the experience of Black people and the experience of law enforcement. Like, we can't not say that is a thing, because if we all agreed that this was the experience across the spectrum, we could have a fundamental policy discussion about next steps. And so now we've found that divestment and reinvestment seems to be a better messaging point, and that's great. But we also have to encourage our policymakers to lean into what that actually means, right? And that is on every level of government, for federal, especially down to local, our city council folks as well, and county commissioners as well. As Senator Bullard said, there is a significant amount of money of our municipal budgets that's allocated to local law enforcement. And so many politicians are going to be afraid to name it and say divestment and reinvestment or defund the police, because of these political overtures that have been kind of layered onto this, making this, excuse my dog, a messaging problem rather than an actual discussion about making sure that every person in America has a safe way to move around this country. And so I certainly think that our next steps here are to continue to name it and to call it out when it's being abused and pimped out. But we certainly have to not be afraid to say that thing and hold our elected officials accountable, who won't actually, stand up for something and actually make a policy making vote because of this unfortunate abuse that has happened on the right.
Thank you for that, Ma'Khia. And that really, for all three of you, that leads me to think, let's say reinvestment and divestment is no longer connected to, we're going to lose all our cops. And let's say there is an equitable, as Dwight, you mentioned, an equitable kind of push out into communities in terms of resources. What would be the alternatives to the policing? What are alternatives to policing that may or may not exist currently, or something we can kind of lean into? I think people get really scared when we talk about divestment. Oh, everybody's going to lose police, but it's because there's no alternative, right? There's no major alternative. I have arguments all the time with fellow friends that are police officers, and they're like, "You'll be the first one to call us if something happens." Yes, because there is no alternative currently. What are some of the alternatives to policing? And everybody's mic is off, so I'm going to assume that.
Well, I just didn't want to go first this time. I was trying to give my other folks an opportunity to jump in there, but I'll just piggyback on what Carl was saying around the Eugene, Oregon model, right? So, when you really break that down, Eugene, Oregon still spends about $135 million on policing for that alternative program, which is basically having mental health counselors or be the first responders to crisis around mental health. They're only spending about $2.4 million, right? So I want you to think about that. But here's the kicker. I think they said something like 25% of the calls that were going to police were for these mental health exercises, right? Or these mental health issues. So they're only diverting $2.4 million to deal with a 25% issue of the calls that you were getting for police. Now, if we look at the remaining proportional amount of calls that are going to police, and we can also take, and again, I appreciate Carl with the data, that 95% of the arrests that are being made are being made for issues related to substance abuse, issues related to to crisis, issues related to homelessness, issues related to poverty, then that means that the alternative is solving those problems. I know it sounds like a crazy idea, right? But the idea that, and we talk about the diversification of the 911 operation system that we have, I want to remind folks that if your house is on fire and you dial 911, they don't send the police, right? Right? I just want people to note that because a lot of the concern and chaos that created in people's minds is like, I dial 911 and I tell them what I need on the other end. Who's it going to be? And to your point, Nestor, if we create a system in which we truly make an investment in the concerns and needs of people, right, and address those things, meaning that we staff mental health crisis at the same way we staff police officers. We staff, EMTs and ambulance and emergency services. We staff homeless services. We staff drug intervention at the same rate and way in which we deal with police. You will find that the need to send an armed human being to many of these calls would almost be eradicated. The idea of being able to call someone and say, my son or daughter is having a crisis, and having somebody show up to solve that crisis should not be far-fetched. And as a former public school teacher, I used to see that, like, the idea that this can't be solved without weapons strapped to you is like, it's almost like the old adage where it's like, ask a paraprofessional, it's like, hold my beer. I do this every day. Like, this is what I do every day with no gun strapped to my hip. I calm people down. I bring people down out of crisis, and I deal with it, and I go home. And I promise you, if you were paying them $65K a year to do it, comparable to what we pay police officers to do the same thing, I think, they'd be happy to help. You dig what I'm saying? So I just need people to understand that we're already seeing this. We see it play out in our everyday lives. It's just we have to apply that same energy to solving those problems.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Dwight. Much appreciated. Ma'Khia?
Yeah, I guess I just want to jump in and like really hone in on what the senator was saying about naming these issues of substance abuse, behavioral and mental health as societal issues. Like, for too long, we've tried to like closet these as individual problems, like go out and solve these things by yourself, even though, as he already provided the context there around many of these substance abuse problems being political initiatives that have come into our communities that we are now faced with solving individually. And so now, unfortunately, because we don't have alternatives, law enforcement is our only response. And so I think a great alternative is to thinking about, and St. Pete did it here in Tampa Bay, deploying mental health advisors and caseworkers to certain scenarios, right? And so I think, of course, that takes a certain amount of initiative during the 911 and first responders process to really vet what the issue is, right? And really have a better sense of what's happening instead of doing a knee-jerk reaction to deploy law enforcement. Like, is this a behavioral health issue? Do we need somebody to come out and like sustain that properly? And if we don't want to do that because we still want to empower law enforcement, train law enforcement to respond to this in kind with what folks actually need, right? And I think there is a legislative overture here that we also have to name and acknowledge, right? I think in Florida, we don't have a lot of bandwidth when it comes to responding, especially from a public safety perspective, to behavioral and mental health issues. We have like Baker Act, and of course the senator, and probably Carl too, who's an attorney, can expound on that more than I can. But if that's the only response, which is, in my opinion, also incarcerating folks for a certain amount of time, right, to not even really deal with their issues, but to take them there and hold them there for 24 to 48 hours, that is still rooted in this idea of policing and incarcerating folks and still not getting to the root of societal issues.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to be clear, when we're talking about alternatives, it can't just be replacing one form of incarceration or, taking providing community mental health services that are voluntary, that are compassionate, that are culturally competent is the way to address people's human needs and provide a response that is just it's better all around. As the senator said, if you look at the numbers, it is so much less expensive in the end if you pay upfront to provide the services before the problems turn into a crisis. And also if you pay to provide a response from mental health providers and peer support counselors when it comes to a crisis, that is still something where it doesn't involve the same kind of massive investment that it does when you're asking police to do this as well. And the other thing that I want to note is that there are places that are starting to work on these kinds of divest, reinvest strategies. Brooklyn Center in Minnesota, where police killed Dante Wright during a traffic stop. The city mayor and the city council sat down and thought, how can we have prevented this death? And ended up developing a plan that is now moving forward. That first they adopted a citywide citation and summons policy for the police that for a whole range of traffic infractions, non-felony offenses, and non-felony warrants, requires police to just issue a citation rather than making an arrest. And they are creating a new community response department that consists of trained medical and mental health professionals, social workers, other expert staff, and volunteers to start developing this dispatch and response infrastructure for all of these other issues that are currently only handled by police. They are creating a new unarmed civilian traffic enforcement department that is responsible for enforcing all non-moving traffic violations in the city. Again, trying to look at the circumstances of Dante Wright's death and ask, how can we set up an infrastructure that would have prevented this? And they're creating a new permanent community safety and violence prevention committee that is a majority of city residents with direct experience or the close experience of family members of being arrested, detained, or having other contacts with the police to help shape and guide these strategies moving forward.
Wow. So, I mean, there are definitely communities that are doing something, and it's obvious that there are lots of things that can be done, right? There are tons of alternatives to our current policing structure. Now, knowing this and knowing that there are resources out there that can reinvest, we also know that there are lots of protections in place to keep the current system in place. Lots, incredible protections, as a matter of fact, protections that you will not find in any other professional field. And some of those protections are like qualified immunities. Some of those protections are the Police Bill of Rights. And some of those protections are just our legislators and our unions or their police unions. So I'm going to come to a real quick community question that we have right here. So thank you for whoever asked this question. What is the underlying issue of police unions and their political power? And I would add to that just everything, right? The overall political power that backs law enforcement in its current structure. Dwight, you want to kick us off on that one?
Yeah, sure thing. I mean, there are, the FOP and the PBA are the Fraternal Order of Police and the Police Benevolent Association, which are the two major unions in Florida, wield significant power, especially at the local level. I mean, at the state level, they they definitely wield some power, but at the local level, it's almost we have to change the narrative around what their endorsement means and what that means for community, right? Because again, if we're talking about 30+% or darn near 50, or in some cases over 50% of your city's budget going to this particular entity, what bang are you getting for your buck? So I'm asking, so this is the application that I would give for the average community resident. And when I'm speaking to you, I'm speaking to you when you're asking yourself, why aren't your parks programs being funded? What's going on with the public transportation system? These are the things that are like everyday community concerns. And that application of that amount of money going to law enforcement, you have to ask yourself, is there a better way to resource that? And really get at the root of, the power that the police unions tend to wield at the local level. You have mayors, you have city council people, you have county commissioners, et cetera, that are all fighting for this endorsement, wanting to say things like, they always like to spin the narrative about the good, we have good people in these positions. It's not a question of the sincerity of the person or the well-meaning of an individual who takes on a job. It really does boil down to the idea of a system that is not functioning correctly. It is not resourcing the things that we need. It is not wielding the outcomes that we need. I mean, I know of no other system where if the thing that you're trying to get rid of, i.e. the crime rate, goes up, that we continue to fund that system. Imagine, being an education system and every year kids were, unable to read less and less. And then people going and being like, they would have dismantled public schools a long time ago had that been the case. And that's oftentimes the criticism of the public school system is, where are your outcomes? What's your data? What's all these other things? Only in America do we have a scenario in which whether crime goes down or goes up, we keep funneling money into this system, into a system, and perpetually funding these things without looking for any alternative. And I think we really have to escape from that as a culture and a society.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Dwight. Ma'Khia, do you want to just kind of note maybe some of the Florida legislative issues and support behind law enforcement agencies?
Yeah, and I'm so glad that somebody asked that in the chat, because I think that is super important as we continue to think about what next steps in terms of policy reform when it relates to the police looks like. I will let you know that the Florida Legislative Black Caucus did a lot of work to have both members in the House and the Senate file bills and produce a package of legislation for hearings during this last legislative session, many of which never made it to its first committee stop for all of the reasons that Senator Bullard just uplifted about the enormous amount of power that law enforcement and their unions wield in this state. But I think what we have to applaud is that there was some success in a state where we don't normally see success for everyday Floridians, right? And that was really driven by Representative Fentrice Driscoll, who is based out of Tampa. But I want to just highlight a couple pieces of legislation that were included in that package. One was demilitarization, right? Like it is not lost on us that there is a significant amount of equipment that is given to local law enforcement in terms of military equipment. And so how are we ensuring that if we're having this conversation and trying to ensure and build trust with folks in the community, that militarized equipment isn't being used to patrol and over police there. The second was trying to reform qualified immunity, which lends itself to this idea about accountability and the unionization that's happening in the state of Florida. The third was also trying to standardize training for folks who are coming into law enforcement and trying to really get to the heart and soul behind cultural standards when it comes to joining police forces across the state of Florida. And then another big one that I wanted to make sure that folks know was making sure that there was a public-facing database for use of force incidents. And the idea was to make sure that law enforcement officers who either had incidents of use of deadly force, of use of excessive force, weren't able to jump from agency to agency without any accountability if those incidents were found, especially, and there's a whole other conversation about citizen review panels and boards, that goes into that process of accountability there. But the idea is that the public had a way to access that information, especially to hold and put pressure on local law enforcement and subsequently municipal elected officials around them. But like I said, none of those had hearings this past legislative session, which is certainly unfortunate because of many things. But all of this was birthed, especially by the Legislative Black Caucus, in response to yet again another a murder that we saw, with George Floyd. And folks are asking for something different. They were asking for some substantive, systemic change in policy to make sure that we could begin to right the wrongs that have lasted us for centuries. But again, I think we can take some sort of hope here that there was success when it came to codifying a minimum age of arrest in Florida. Of course, that took a couple of sessions to get to that point, but I believe is the age 7 now. I believe that folks can't, which is awful, but considering where we are, I think we can do with that information as we will, and then also limiting the use of chokeholds. And so again, in a place like Florida that is run solely on partisanship, I think we can really at least applaud some of our legislators who were there to push this, especially folks like Rep. Driscoll and others who stayed on leadership to at least see this through to the end. And now it's up to the governor to make a decision, and whether or not he's going to use his veto pen to strike legislation like this down. But this is the beginning, right? Like, as many of us know, stuff in Florida, unless it only benefits the top 1% or special interests, takes a long time to go through the legislative process, and we see it come back over multiple sessions. And so if there was a call to action for folks, take a look at the legislation that was proposed this legislative session, and encourage your elected officials that about it and push them to support it, because a lot of folks, especially politicians in Tallahassee, think that everyday folks aren't paying attention so they can do whatever they want, and that lack of accountability is seemingly not there. But if we know and we are loud and stay on them about the policies we want to see, we certainly can support the folks in the minority in Tallahassee who are pushing for these changes as well.
Thank you for that, Ma'Khia. Thank you so much. And thank you to our panelists. Unfortunately, this is a conversation that we could have on, and it could last 4, 5, 6 days, let alone 45 minutes. So I just wanted to close us out by saying thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Carl. Thank you, Ma'Khia. Thank you, Dwight. And thank you to everybody else that decided to participate in today's conversation. If there was a call to action, continue to do your research. Do what you can at the local level to hold people accountable, and then reach out to the decision makers, those people that are funding your law enforcement agencies, those people that are supporting your law enforcement agencies, and just push back. At the end of the day, we are all human, which is great, but that means we are all subject to the human condition, the elements of the human condition, which means law enforcement officers are not excluded from feeling anger and frustration and contempt for other people. And that does play out under the badge and the gun that they wear. So we're just saying hold police officers accountable. We're saying the system was built on as was mentioned, the system was built on racist policies and procedures. And we're saying go out there, do your homework, push back, and let's all continue the fight, because we know that things can be just and fair for all of us instead of just a few of us. So thank you so much on behalf of the ACLU of Florida. Thank you again to our panelists, and a special thank you to all the communities and organizations that are doing the good work dismantling this broken system of biased policing. and bringing some sort of semblance of hope and peace back to our communities. Thank you so much, and I wish all of you a wonderful evening.